Oh, Fausto.
So he contacted me like a month ago because he's giving some talk somewhere, has been invited somewhere to give a presentation, how to give presentations, write papers. And think for this reason, and also because many of you, in particular the younger of you, they are all very busy writing the qualifying. They are very busy now learning how to do presentations. I think this could be a very good experience. I hope, I'm very happy to see that Xiaoye is registering this presentation. I hope that Vincenzo will agree so that we can put a website for future reference. Of course, we all know, and you all know that I put the slides for how to write a paper somewhere in the Google Drive. And I really insist, I've already done with most of you to go there and read my slides. But as usual, a live presentation is much better than just some few dry slides. So with all of these, I'm very happy to introduce Enzo. And by the way, Enzo, take the time you need, don't rush. And please, in the end, I know, please ask questions if you have any questions. I do know that writing paper seems very easy when you do it in theory, but in practice it's very hard. Some of you are really dealing with the hardness of the practice. So let's exploit Enzo. Thank you, Enzo.
Thank you, Fausto. It's a pleasure for me to be here and give this presentation, also because you gave me the opportunity to speak in English again after a couple of years. I'm only speaking in Italian because of my new duties here at the University of Trento. So as you said, now I was a PhD student, I was a postdoc researcher, I wrote some papers, most of them with you, and so I acquired some experience in writing papers. Now I'm on the technical side of the university, administrative side of the university, and I'm dealing with disseminating results of the university. So I'm in charge of the main institutional repository of the University of Trento, in which all publications should be uploaded, and of their promotion and all other duties connected with that. So, for instance, the annual, the periodical evaluation campaign of the Italian Ministry of Research. So what I'm going to present you, as Fausto said, is a small presentation, introductory presentation about how to write a scientific paper. It comes from my experience as a researcher for 10 years, but also from reading some books. So I warmly recommend you to read books about how to write scientific papers, because as Fausto usually says, a lot of things sound obvious at the end, but they are not obvious at all. So you need to read about how to do things. And the hard way is to practice, practice, and practice. So every single opportunity you have to write papers, technical reports, presentations, and so on, take it, because it is really important to practice. So I'm going to give you some tips today. So I'm going to share my screen. Please give me feedback, because after I will share the screen, I think I will not see you anymore. So at least give me some. Okay, I'm going to open it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, let me start with a kind of outline of what I will discuss during this presentation. So first of all, as I said, and as also stressed by Fausto, writing a paper is a kind of art. It requires a lot of practice, and it is extremely hard to write a paper. First of all, because you have to have a clear idea of what you want to write in details, and also you should be able to put yourself on the side of the reader. So you really have to make sure that whatever you have in mind is clearly described and can be understood by every single person in the target community. So I'm going to give you some feedback about this. So the presentation is organized in 3 parts. So I have an introductory slide in which I will give you a few research principles. Then there is a part about what you should do before starting writing a paper. And at the end, there is the half of the presentation is about actually writing the paper. Interrupt me at any moment if you have questions. Better to have an interactive session, I think, because in this way you don't forget your questions, and we are in the point in which you have exactly the topic discussed. So the initial slide is about ethics and integrity in research. So typically, when you conduct research, you should keep in mind that you should follow some integrity principles. A European document, the so-called European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, describes some of those principles. Principles like honesty, respect, accountability of what you do. For instance, respect for research subjects. In biology, for instance, people make use of animals, and they should be respected according to some specific criteria. The same applies to humans, of course, and it means that not only that you have to treat humans in a certain way, but also data about humans. So there are specific regulations like the GDPR about how to collect and manage data appropriately. So yes, please, Fausto.
Because your first page is not moving. Is that one?
Yeah.
You don't see it moving?
No,
Yeah.
so I think you have to go to visualization because you move, but I think it's stuck on the first page.
Enzo, one more thing, please. Bishu here, so please make it full screen. So I think you,
it
those
is
two
full screen.
No, but I think you put in show mode. Did I think why it is stuck?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not moving actually. Slides are not moving.
Okay, let me try in another way around.
Right. No. Yeah. Now it's moving, but now it's moved, but it's not. You can't just do visualization mode, full screen.
What if I show it in this way?
That's okay.
Okay. So basically, about the integrity, I was talking about integrity in research. So I told you about some fundamental principles that should be followed by all researchers in respecting their subjects, regardless whether they are humans or animals. And not only the subjects themselves, but also their data. So especially if they are humans, you have to follow principles from the GDPR, which is the general regulation for privacy and the way in which data about human subjects should be dealt with. And provides regulations about how to collect and manage data appropriately. So typically what you have to do is to make sure initially that you get the consent of humans, even if you are just interviewing them and in collecting data about them. Collecting and even processing them. So you should be very precise in describing what you will do with data in such a way people is aware of that, and then you have to follow several principles like accountability, for instance, in order to make sure that whatever you have done with data is known to the subjects. There is a lot more about that, and so I encourage you to have a look at the GDPR because really managing data is something that you do in basically in whatever research you conduct. So it is really fundamental for every researcher to be familiar with these principles. In terms of general principles, of course, it's important to avoid plagiarism. So whatever you reuse or write in your paper has to be appropriately cited, not only text, but also pictures, tables, and whatever. Of course, you have to avoid cheating. So this means that whatever you write should be supported, for instance, by means of citations and or experimental data. And also you should favor reproducibility of your work. So when you write about what you have done in your work, it should be described in a way, ideally, in a way in which every other researcher can replicate what you have done. For instance, in the new regulation of the European project, the so-called H-Europe grant agreement, you find specific obligations about how to do that. So in principle, you should provide all the data you used in your experiment, unless you have a strong motivation not to do it. So for instance, because you are you have to follow some secret, or you are going for some patent, or it is because you are funded by specific agencies. Another important principle which is enforced by current European projects is the openness of results. So whatever you publish and is funded by public funds, by public agents and institutions, should follow the so-called FAIR principles. FAIR stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse. So basically your data and also your paper should be findable, accessible to everybody, hopefully for free, and interoperable in the sense that data should be immediately reusable by others, ideally in a machine readable form, in such a way that everybody can not only reuse it, but also can be automatically reused. Any questions so far? Can you still hear me? Are you still there?
Yeah,
Yes,
we
you
are
are
here.
doing very well.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, sometimes I have this doubt because I only can see the slides at the moment. Okay, so if you have questions, please. Otherwise, I go on. Okay. In any case, you can also put notes and ask me your questions at the end. So the next phase is to prepare your research material, because in conducting your experiment, what you have to do is to make sure that you collect the data about what you are doing. So even notes, your observations, your doubts, your hypotheses, your initial results, whatever, in notes, in technical reports, until you have results that you or your advisor believe are solid enough, are enough to start writing papers. So before you start thinking about writing papers, you really have to collect data and text as much as possible. It is always, as I said, is always a good exercise to practice writing in any form, even if at this stage of your research, you don't need to pay attention to the way in which you do it. So just put notes as far as you can understand them. It's enough. Of course, if you want to present intermediate results to your colleagues, better to draft them into internal technical reports. So I guess Fausto still continues with the no-dive technical reports, in which you basically collect your intermediate results and share results with your colleagues. It's always a good idea to do that. Once you collect your research material, it comes a moment in which you are confident enough that you have enough material to produce your initial papers. How to understand that? Well, you should continuously assess the state of the art. So read the papers in your area. And once you are confident enough that what you are doing has not been published yet, is novel enough, is a contribution that can be appreciated by the community, by the communities in your area, then you can start designing your initial papers. I'm saying initial papers because from your material, you can think about deriving multiple papers. So typically, this is like, so let me use this metaphor, it's like traveling. So you have a place and you can travel this place in multiple ways. What I think one important principle in writing a paper that actually I learned from Fausto is one paper, one message. So that is basically in every single paper, you have to communicate only exactly one message. So there is no paper with two messages. So if you have two messages, you need at least two papers. I'm saying at least because you can also sell a message to multiple communities. So you can write the same message for multiple communities. And especially if your paper is based on a multidisciplinary work, and this has to be done by having a clear idea of your contribution. What is the message that you want to communicate to a specific community? And therefore, once you have this clear in your mind, you can start drafting your paper. So as I said, writing a paper is not a general purpose task. So what you have to do is to think to a specific target community. So thinking to your area of expertise, you have to identify a specific community that you want to address. And you can distinguish the community not only by area, but also by venue. So for instance, specific conferences, specific journal papers, and so on. Once you have identified the target community, you have to understand that you have to get familiar with the language that the community uses in writing papers. So you know that when you submit a paper, people will review it and they can accept or reject your work. So if you use a terminology which is unfamiliar to a certain community, they will surely reject your paper. So it's really important that you learn their language and you write the paper by describing and by conveying your message using exactly their terminology. This is fundamental. It's not only a matter of understanding what you wrote, but also they want to feel that you belong to the community in order to accept your paper. And so you have to use a terminology which is familiar enough with the community you are addressing. This is really important. If you are not familiar enough, read as much paper as possible of that community in order to get familiar with the terminology, the language, even the structure of the paper, the way in which the paper is organized is really specific to a certain community. So if you look at the comics here, it's a classical example. In medicine, they use a very specific language, which may depend on the specific sub-discipline, while journalists, they use a slang and other language, which is completely different from the one of doctors and scientists in that community. Within a certain community, then it's time to think about a specific venue. As I said, a specific journal or a specific conference. And you have to select the venue according to some multiple factors. So for instance, and the most important one is the potential impact that you may get from your paper. As I said, writing a paper is very difficult. It takes a lot of time, is a huge investment. Therefore, given that you have to spend a lot of your time in writing a paper, you have to make sure that your effort pays enough. So therefore, you have to make sure that the paper you write gets as much impact as possible in your community. To do that, you have to identify a venue which can give you the maximum potential impact in terms of visibility and in terms of citations. You know that in journals, there is the so-called impact factor. The impact factor basically is the average number of citations that a paper gets when published in a certain journal. It may vary year by year. There are indexes, even in Google, there are ways to identify the impact factor of the different journals in different communities. Consider also the possibility to submit your paper in an open access journal, which means that is a journal which allows reading your paper for free. In order to get the open access, there are multiple ways. There are journals which are open access by default. Whoever publishes a paper gets open access for its readers. But there are, in other cases, you have to pay a fee in order to get it open access. In some other cases, is only can be accessed only by paying a certain fee. So you have to consider also this, because there is enough evidence in the community that in order to have a certain impact, so open access papers typically gets a lot more citations than usual standard papers. So you may get even 2-3 times or even 5 times the number of citations if you publish in an open access journal. So it's your interest, but it's also an ethical, there is also an ethical point, because if you publish your research as open, everybody can access it. Even scientists with no funds can get access to your research. Last point is that whenever you prepare yourself to writing in a certain venue, you have to consider the instruction for authors. So every journal, every conference has its own template that you have to make sure you use in order to publish the paper in that venue. The last slide about tips about before starting writing is about how to describe your research. So forget about what you have, how you got your findings. So you don't have to describe in your paper, you know, I got these results because by chance I discovered that by combining this with that, I can obtain this result. This is not a good way to present a paper. So you have to start from a certain hypothesis, and then you have to demonstrate that by designing an experiment in a certain way and by following specific methodologies which are well accepted in your community, you got that results. So you have somehow to reframe the way in which you got your results in a way in which is well accepted by your community, and it can be easily understood by people in your community, and can easily understand what are the important findings of your work. This is very, very important. So the way in which you describe your work should follow a logical order rather than an historical order. So something like I did this first and this secondly and so on. This is not a good way to present. But it should follow a logical order, something that the reader can follow step by step. So far, so good?
Excuse me.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Hello, Fausto. Hi, everybody. My question is about data collection in general. What can we do with the organizations that prevent to share their data for research? More especially in some medical organizations like hospitals. What can we do?
Okay, so this is a very specific case. So medical data, health, all data about health of the people is sensitive data. So you have to treat it with special care. You have to make sure that data is stored in a place in which scientists dealing with them can access with the consent of the human subjects. But at the end, when you share your data, you have to share them anonymized. This is the general principles. Then there might be exceptions. But typically, when you share this data to the research community, it has to be shared by following specific practices, which may depend by the institutions in which the research is conducted. So every single institution may have its own repositories, its own policies to manage the data. And but at the end, when you share data in a secure way or publicly, you have to share it by following principles which are established by your institution and by your research group. But typically, as I said, it has to be anonymized. So there should be no way to reconduct the data to a specific human subject. So you can say, I have this data about this group, which is composed and has these characteristics, but the way in which you describe your data set should be in such a way you cannot reconduct data to specific human subjects. Is it clear enough?
Yeah. Thank you.
Of course, as I said, this means also to have some sort of instruments, some sort of tools to do that. Maybe Fausto, you did also some projects on that. Maybe you want to complement what I said.
No, it is only, yes, we did a lot of work. The more sensitive the data, the more complicated. It's a huge area of research, but what you said is right. And you learn by doing. I mean, like, that's really hard. It's actually one of the most important issues today, so, because of GDPR. Now, I mean, we take entire lecture and more.
Actually, it's becoming really important. European projects strictly recommend that you do that. If you don't do that, they don't give you funds. And this is really important. In designing your research, before starting collecting data, you have to produce a plan, which is called the data management plan, in which you have to describe how you will manage, collect, distribute your data in details. Otherwise, the European community will not give you funds. This is really important. And even if you are not conducting your research in the framework of a project, you must follow this principle because it is by law. The GDPR says that you have to really collect data according to some legal principles. Otherwise, you are in trouble. So researcher really need to be aware of the basic principles in doing this. And it is becoming a must. So you cannot anymore conduct research if you don't have at least a basic understanding of these principles. So really, I recommend you to give a look at least to some summaries of what GDPR is, just to have a flavor of what it means to collect the data in a correct way. Okay, so now you are basically ready to start writing the paper. So I'm going through a few tips about how to actually write a scientific paper. So you start from the title. So in the title should condense three main things: the problem, the solution, and the context in which you are approaching the problem and solution. For instance, a possible title could have this form: using a certain solution for a certain problem in a certain context. You see here an example. So the use of comics. So comics is the solution in experimental instructions. So the problem is how to provide experimental instructions. So I can provide experimental instruction by using comics. In which context? In a non-formal chemistry learning context. So this title is very explicit. It maps perfectly with the three basic items: context, problem, solutions. But then you can have multiple variations of that. So you can have titles which are very general and can only provide the problem, because, for instance, it's a survey paper. Or they can provide problem and solution because it is general purpose. It doesn't provide a specific context of application. And in some other cases, you address a specific context. For instance, in medicine, or in a specific subdiscipline, or in a specific environment. So a good title should contain all these three items together. So I really suggest you next time you read a paper to give a look at the paper, the title of the paper, by trying to understand whether the title conveys the context, the problem, and the solution. Once you have in mind these three aspects and the main message that you want to give with your paper, then you can move on. You know that in a paper there are multiple authors contributing to the paper. Typically, the list of authors comes right after the title, and there are multiple ways to do that. So according to the community, as I said, a paper is not writing a paper is not a general purpose task. You do it for a specific community, and in every community there are some rules that you should follow in listing the authors. So in some communities, it is strictly required to list them in alphabetical order. In some other communities, it's a matter of importance. So usually the first author is the one who contributed the most to the research. And then you agree with your co-authors about an order of importance, and then you basically list them in order of importance. Here you see a joke in which basically you arbitrarily decide the importance of the authors in your paper according to your own principles of importance, let's say. So basically, you agree with your co-authors about the order of contribution, and then you list them accordingly. Then you have to keep in mind that the paper is characterized by a course structure, so the skeleton. and a fine-grained structure. The coarse structure is basically the backbone of the paper, the skeleton of the paper, the way in which you present it by the main headings of the paper. So typically, the core structure of a paper is characterized by a title, followed by an abstract, an introduction, and then you have sections which may depend also by the community, as I said, but typically you have the state of the art, then you describe the methodology that you used and the materials that you used for conducting your research, the results, so the experimental results of your research, and then in a separate section you provide an interpretation, a discussion of your results. So it's really a good practice to separate the presentation of the data and the results of your experiment from your considerations and your and the discussion of those results, what you can infer from your data. And then finally, you have the conclusion with a description of future directions of your work. Finally, you have acknowledgements. So the list of projects and people that you thank and contributed to your work, apart from your co-authors, of course, and then the list of references. So some people say that a paper is something between an introduction and conclusions. So it really may depend on the community you publish. If you have a look at the papers in your community, you will learn that they have a typical structure. So the more you are close to the structure that people expect from you in the community, the better, because you will get a better acceptance of your work in that community. So in thinking about your paper, you should first think about the skeleton of the paper. So what are the main sections that you will use to convey the message? Once you have in mind the skeleton of the paper, then you can start going one step ahead and think about the purpose of each element in the paper. So the purpose of the title is really to convey what the paper is about and convince the reader to actually read your paper. So it should be fancy enough, attractive enough in order to convince your colleagues that your paper is worth reading it. Then the abstract, which is typically between 200 and 400 words long, is a very short summary and description of your work. Typically should expand a little bit more the context, the problem, and the solution. And it may provide some hints about the methods, the results, and conclusions of the work, of your work. But just a little, because the main, all the rest should be written in the other sections. So abstract is also the part which is typically indexed in search engines. So for when you are searching for a paper and you type some keywords in order to search for a paper, typically search engines searching title and abstract mainly. Then you have the introduction, whose purpose is to again convince the reader to go furthermore in the rest of the paper, and therefore it may contain some more about the abstract, providing more details about your main contribution, and also can provide some references about state of the art or other papers that you wrote in the topic, just to link what you are going to present in the paper with the state of the art in the area. One important thing is that abstract and introduction are typically written at the end because they are a kind of summary of your work. Therefore, whatever you write in the other section should be written first in order to then be able to write a summary of those in the abstract and in the introduction. When you start drafting the course structure of your paper, you should write a kind of itemized list of the sentences what you are going to describe in the section. So basically, at the end of this initial exercise, you should have something like 2 pages in which you have the skeleton with the index of your paper, and some sentences within each section with an idea of what you will write in each section in logical order in order to present the message to the community. It may even take several days to come up with this initial structure, but it's if you succeed in doing that, maybe half of the work is done, in the sense that it can give you a clear idea that you have, you know exactly the message that you want to convey, you know exactly how to convey the message, and therefore you are ready to work to the details, so to work to the rest of the text by expanding each itemized sentence that you have put in the sections. So far so good. Any questions so far? Still there?
Yes.
Okay. So let's move to the fine-grained structure. So once you have your skeleton, once you have a clear idea of what you want to convey within each section, then you have to expand each section into paragraphs. So basically, each paragraph should be exactly the expansion of the initial of one of those initial sentences that you put in the section you designed. So initially each section should appear as a list of sentences. So something like the reader should understand that this notion is important, and then in order to obtain this result, there are step number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and therefore you expand the initial sentence, step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, and so on and so on. Each paragraph and each sentence should be functional to the message. So forget about sentences which are there just to provide some of your thoughts or something for which you don't have yet enough evidence from your data, from your experiments, from state of the art. So every single sentence in the paper should be functional to your message. Use example as needed. So if a sentence conveys a concept which is difficult to understand, you can provide examples to let the reader understand what you want to say. Provide evidence by citations and experimental data, and make sure that whatever you write is written exactly once in the paper. So if you don't design properly your paper, the risk of providing sentences which are redundant or pieces of text which are duplications in multiple places of the paper is quite high. I remember my initial papers. So typically you tend to duplicate, and therefore you in reading again your paper, you have to make sure that every single piece of information is exactly described in one single point of your paper. So given that the paper is a journey in your research, passing through two different destinations is a risk that you have to avoid. So basically, if you discover that you have done this, then you have to redesign and to move text from one place of the paper to another in order to make sure that you describe one notion in only one place. Of course, it's okay to mention and to provide references to other sections, but only references, not rewriting and redescribing the same thing twice or thrice. So this is a very important principle to follow. Then you have to pay attention to every single sentence. So every single sentence should be clear enough, should be concise, grammatically correct. Make sure that it is functional to your message and it's clear to your reader. So the most difficult thing is to put yourself in the clothes of the reader. So you have to think as you were the reader. So is the reader familiar enough with what I'm describing? If not, I have to provide an example. I have to provide the references. I have to expand the sentence by providing more details. Make sure that in reading, in writing the paper, what you write follow a logical order. Therefore, the sentence can be understood in the context in which you have put it. So if you moved a certain sentence elsewhere in the paper, maybe it's not clear anymore. So if you need to move some piece of text, you have to make sure that it can be still understood by the reader. So really, it's important that you pay attention even at the level of a single sentence. Of course, the shorter the better, because you know every single notion can be expressed in multiple ways. There is no one single way to state something. So let me give you an example. For instance, I can say, I wrote a paper together with Fausto. Or I can say, Fausto and I wrote a paper together. Or there is a paper which is co-authored by Fausto and me. Or I can say, the paper has been co-authored by Fausto and me. So you see, there are many ways to state the same thing. And therefore, in thinking about writing a sentence in a paper, you have to think about the most convenient way to write and describe what you want to say. And the shorter, the better. The less technical terms you use, the better. And you have to make sure that the sentences are always sentences which are supported by data or by references. Sometimes you may start drafting something in your paper. You may discover that you don't have enough evidence, scientific evidence of what you are writing, and therefore you may decide either to delete the sentence or look into the state-of-the-art for evidence, so for a paper supporting your sentence, and therefore once you have it, you cite it, or to continue in your experiments as soon as you have enough evidence of that. So there are, but whatever you write, at the time in which you write it, must be supported. And as I said, you may think about rewarding your sentence in many ways until you believe that the sentence is clear enough and conveys the message and is functional to the paper. And then it's not the end, because then you have to pay attention to a single word, every single word in your paper. So you know that in every single community, some words may have a specific meaning which is well understood to the community. So you have to be sure you know, let's say, the basic vocabulary of your community. So in your community, there are technical terms which are well known in that community, and you must use those words with the common meaning which is given to that word, to that community. So for instance, semantic matching or artificial intelligence are terms which are understood with a specific meaning in a certain community. Or, I don't know, cell in medicine, for instance. You cannot use the word cell in biology with a different meaning with respect to the one which is usually understood by that community. Therefore, in using words, you have to make sure that every word is used with the meaning which is expected by that community. And if you use the same word multiple times in the paper, you have to make sure that every single time you mention that word is used with exactly the same meaning. So you cannot use a word by thinking about a certain meaning at the beginning of the paper and then with a different meaning at the end of the paper. This may happen, for instance, in the case in which you have some initial drafts in which during your research, which maybe is conducted in 3-4 years, you change the way in which you think to certain terms, you change the meaning, or maybe in different papers you write something with using different terminology, and then you have to write a final journal paper collecting results from conference papers, and therefore you have to come up with one single word which conveys different meanings that you use or different terms that you use in different papers. So at the end, you have to select one single word which is commonly understood by the community. You know that in English, like in any other language, words may be used with different meanings. So simply because a word, for instance, think for instance to the term bank, which may mean banked institution, the economic institution, or banks of the river, or the word leg of as the part of the body, or the leg of the table, and so on. There are, in this group, you should be familiar with the notion of synonymy, polysemy, and so on. So really it is important, or semantics. So semantics, like the meaning of a word. So it's really important that when you write your text, you have in mind the meaning of a word. If a word can be ambiguous, better to specify in terms of definitions in your paper what you mean by that word, if that word doesn't have already a well-established meaning in the community, and use it consistently across your paper. There are words that should be avoided. For instance, words like interesting, useful, significant, unless you explain what you mean by that, because it doesn't mean anything in science. Something like the data I'm presenting in this paper are interesting. What does that mean? So interesting by which reason? So you have to explain the reason why your data is interesting. From which point of view? Because it is useful to solve a certain problem. Which problem? And why? And so on and so on. So I forgot to tell you about also the notion of acronyms. So you know that if you have a very long term to describe something, you can use acronyms. So a short term to refer to that word. And the first time you use the long word, you should introduce also the acronym and use it consistently across the paper. Okay. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I move on. Okay, I move on. So the role of citations. So I said, I told you that citations are a way by which you provide evidence of what you are writing. For sure, you have to provide citations for the state of the art, and your paper can be seen as new knowledge on top of the state of the art. So you should provide enough citation to state what is the knowledge which is the closest to yours you are contributing. And also citations are used to support what you are stating and can be useful in order to convey your message together with the results of your experiments, data about your experiments. How many citations to provide in a paper? There is no golden rule. So, I mean, there are communities in which 20 are enough. Other communities in which 20 is too much. It may depend also on the kind of paper. If it is a workshop paper, you may provide really a few citations. If it is a conference paper, typically you have to provide more citations. If it is a journal paper, typically you can provide even hundreds of citations. It really depends on the community, the venue, the journal, and so on. But you can get familiar with this only by having a look at reading the papers in your area to understand what is the typical number of citation which is considered appropriate. It's not in this slide, but there is also some kind of unwritten standard about the number of self-citations. So you can citate yourself, you can citate your papers, but of course, you cannot, they cannot constitute the majority of citations. You should provide enough citations also about other research groups. It's a kind of, let's say, etiquette of writing a paper. In some communities, self-citations are not even useful, are not even counted as citations, for instance, in terms of career or something else. So therefore, as in writing papers, also this kind of notion can be acquired by practice and by reading papers in your area. Then another important principle is that every single paper is self-contained. What that it means? It means that the reader should be able to understand what you are presenting just by reading your paper. So if there are specific notions that the reader must know in order to understand your paper, better you introduce them briefly in your paper by providing some small description of the notion, by providing some examples as needed, and by providing references about how to find more details about a specific concept. But you should provide enough details in such a way the reader, even without reading other papers, can understand the content of your paper. This is really important. Otherwise, people will stop reading your paper and will not consider it. So maybe even when you submit it, it will not be accepted at all, because even the reviewers will not understand what you are going to present. Emphasis. So you may underline, you may provide more emphasis to some of the words in your paper. You can use bold, italic, underline text, even indexing, so providing itemized lists are ways to provide emphasis some part of your paper. Of course, if you use it too much, it's like non using it. So if you look at this comic in the slide, you see that the text on the left is all the same. So you don't have any emphasis because everything is in bold. If you look at the text on the right side instead, you have only 3 words which are emphasized in bold. So you really get them immediately because emphasis is used with parsimony. So is used only for the 3 key words which are used here to convey a specific message. So emphasis is important, must be used in a paper, is also a way to make a paper elegant, sexy if you want, because a reader can get the main messages of your paper just by reading the key parts of the paper which are emphasized. And you have to use it functionally in order to convey the right message. In this case, you see that the message is being misunderstood because the reader, actually the person with whom you are speaking with, got the wrong message. So emphasis has to be used by making sure that emphasis conveys the right message, the message you want. The role of figures and tables. So typically figures and tables are used to present the data, not only experimental data, but also data in general. And it's an art by itself. There are entire papers just about how to come up with an effective figure. So therefore, you can imagine I cannot be exhaustive in giving you some hints about designing figures and tables, but I just want to give you one basic principle, which is the one which is emphasized that you see, that is cognitive load. So cognitive load is about how to design a figure or a table in such a way you reduce as much as possible the time of the reader in understanding the message you want to convey through the figure. So as you can see, the one on top is a bad figure because it's too crowded. There are too many colors, there are too many labels, and it is really difficult to understand what is the message behind it. So unless you read some text which is together with the picture, you really don't grasp anything from that picture. The one below instead is an example of good picture because you reduce to the minimum the colors, you reduce to the minimum the lines, you reduce to the minimum the numbers, the labels, and so on. And you also provide some emphasis, even here, like flapping color stars, so you have an arrow, which emphasizes the most important part of the figure you should pay attention on. So in order to learn how to design a good figure and a good table, I really invite you to identify some books. For instance, you can look at books about storytelling with data, which is used at managerial level in companies, and it's becoming also a skill which is required in companies and in research groups, because really designing a paper designing a figure which is always useful to convince your audience of a certain phenomenon or a certain thing, a figure plays an important role. Figures should be always accompanied, so should always come up with a title in bold, may be followed by a short description, which constituted a caption. And the text describing the figure and the text which mentions the figure should be as close as possible to the figure, of course. At the end, once you have designed the coarse structure, the fine-grained structure of the presentation, your paper should look like a kind of tree. So you have the main headings, which constitute the branches of the tree, and then sections constitute the smaller branches of your tree, and then all the paragraphs and the single sentences constitute the leaves, the leaves of your tree. At the end, the reader should be able to grasp what your paper is actually conveying at a first look. So already the structure of the paper should convey some initial messages, and it should appear well presented. I mean, it should appear also elegant, harmoniously, and the reader should have the feeling that it's easy to understand what every single section is meant to convey. Typically, even the way in which a paper is read is not just the order of the text. So typically, once you approach a paper, you start from the title. Maybe you give a look to the abstract. Maybe you read it entirely, but then you decide: is the paper worth reading? If yes, you go on, have a look at the main headings to see how it is organized, the introduction to understand whether it is going to give you useful information, and then you may skip through the other sections in order to look at the details, but only if it is convincing enough that is worth reading. And therefore, by keeping it in mind, you have to design your paper by making sure that in every single section you are convincing enough, and you convince enough the reader to read it fully. Are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to finish a couple of more slides. So the revision process. So as I said, and maybe you experience already, writing a paper takes a lot of time. It's not a one-shot purpose. So you write it once and then you revise it many times, hopefully with the help of your advisor at the beginning, then with the help of your colleagues, your co-authors, and maybe you have a community. You can send the paper, some trusted colleagues who can help you in giving you some feedback. For instance, they can tell you, look, this part is not clear enough. You can be more effective if you change this, or you update this, or you provide more evidence here and here. And once you get feedback, you have to revise your paper. It may take multiple times. You may even arrive to the final version of your paper after 30 versions, 40 versions of your paper. So you understand it's really expensive to write a paper. And the more you invest in a paper, the more you make sure so that it can get a better impact. Because if the paper is not well presented, even if it gets accepted by the reviewers, make sure that it will not get any citation. So if you want to make sure it gets an impact, you really have to pay a certain effort in writing it. A word processor can be useful because it may help you discovering some I don't know, grammatical mistakes, typos. It even suggest you how to rephrase a certain sentence. And it is important, especially in those venues in which there is a limit in the page length or in the number of words that you can use in writing your paper. For instance, I remember once I had to submit a paper for a journal requiring a very short version of a paper, only 2 pages. And I was paying a lot of attention in every single word in order to make sure it fits the 2 papers. Even changing some words with others with the same meaning which are shorter. For instance, changing nevertheless with yet to make sure it takes less space. Sometimes you may even need this in order to make sure it respects the page limit of your venue. Finally, acknowledgements. So make sure you thank all the people that helped you in conducting your research, not only co-authors, which are in the list of authors, but also maybe a few colleagues who helped you in reviewing the paper, in giving you some feedback, or just helped you technically in collecting or managing your data, and so on and so on. Whoever helped you in some way should be thanked through the acknowledgements. You have also some obligations in some cases. So for instance, in the case your institutions require certain mentions to the institution, or in case of projects which are funded by some specific bodies, for instance, the European Commission, you have to mention the project, name and grant number, and the institutions from where you got the funds. So these are typical things that you acknowledge in papers. Of course, you are free to expand this list with also. I'm thinking to your dissertation. You may also acknowledge your family, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, and so on. This is perfectly fine, especially in some contexts. In scientific paper, it's a little less accepted, but typically you thank colleagues in scientific papers. So thank you for the attention. I'm also acknowledging in this presentation as well. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and really I recommend you to read papers and practice in writing, reading books about how to write a scientific paper, and reading books about how to design an effective picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enzo. I want to say 2 things. First of all, these slides I think are very useful, are saved in our repository in the training. They are together with my old slides I used to use when I was teaching how to write papers. But I think these provide a very good condensed view. I think they are very good, so you can find them there. And also I hope and I think that it's agreed to put this talk online. So this will be available. And now we can take a few questions. And let me tell you, maybe everything he said looked easy to you. But well, you'll find out how easy it is. So any questions, please? This is the moment to ask any questions, even specific. Alessio, please.
Hello. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. And I have probably general question. So you mentioned that we should address a specific community when we are writing a paper. However, I'm thinking about that on the fact that most of the publication, so the very impactful publication, are actually publications which are general purpose, like published on paper on journals like Science or Nature. So those papers are not really using let's say they are very general purpose in a sense. So you can find a disparate amount of publication from different areas. So how to address those very impactful publication journal in our work? So how be prepared to be able to publish on those journals?
Hi, Alessio. So actually, Nature is a kind of exception. There are some journals in Nature which are still community driven, and therefore you have to follow a specific terminology. There are others which have this general cut, and in fact, in writing them can be particularly difficult because some people gets the help of journalists or some other people in order to be able to learn how to disseminate results in those specific communities. So it's still, so it's similar to the so-called third mission of universities, in which you really have to explain difficult notions to a broader community. In some specific venues of the, let's say, nature broader category, you have to use a specific language which can be understood by a broader community. In some other cases, you are still in the context of a more limited community. I don't know if I answered. If you
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions? You're happy? Let me say one thing to conclude, then we thank Vincenzo. Of course, the question here is, the conclusion is, what is the purpose of writing a paper? And of course, the purpose is obvious. I mean, all the talk by Enzo said that. The purpose is to make the others understand what you've done. But as all of you will find, if you go through the process Enzo described, in the end, the real purpose of writing the paper is to make you understand what you've done. Because until you really write a paper, you don't really know what you've done. To know something, not only to have some random results, to know something is to be able to discuss it, to defend it, to get in argumentation, to play with it. It is only by writing the paper that you learn how to do this. And then, of course, there's a second part, how to do a presentation. So when are you going to give us a talk on how to give a presentation? That will be the next one, because I think
that's yet another book. I mean, there are several books about this topic too. I mean, writing a good presentation is similar to writing, so it's similar to designing a good picture. I mean, you have to be very minimal. You have to balance text and pictures, and there are entire books really about this topic. But let me come back to what you said. It's really important. I mean, when you write a paper, you may discover that you didn't understand what you did. And actually, you may discover you don't have enough results, or you have to conduct more experiments, or you have to rethink completely to what you have done. Therefore, the sooner you try to write a paper, the better, because it helps you in understanding if you are doing the right thing, or you have to rethink about how you redesign what you are doing, rethink about the methodologies that you are using in conducting your research. So it's a kind of test of your research. So you can really understand whether what you are doing is significant in your field, and actually you understood enough what you are doing, and what are the main messages of what you are doing.
Good. So very good. I assume that nobody else wants to say something. Then a little late, but it was worth it. We close here, and please, I strongly suggest all of you, particularly the ones who are writing the thesis or writing the qualifying, go and listen to this talk. Very careful. Not only it was very well presented, but it's kind of pretty thorough. I mean, pretty much all major issues, if not all issues, are there. So think about it. Good. Thanks, Enzo. And please let us know when you're ready to give the talk on how to give a presentation. And thank you. And thanks, everybody. And see you next Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.